Okay. The vision of the Anointed, self-congratulations as a basic for social policy. I mean, you posit here that they're a group of self-anointed elitists who are responsible for what in America?
Well, for much of the social policy of the past 30 years and for the disastrous consequences that have followed from those policies.
And who are these people?
Well, there would be people in the media, in the academic world, and in politics. Particularly those who believe that third parties can make better decisions than people can make for themselves, and particularly when they are those third parties. I think most people who have not been in the academic world would have to see the academics in action to realize how deeply they believe this. I can remember a conference at Middlebury College some years ago in which they were laying out these plans for how they would manipulate the poor in order to get them to do this, to do that, to do the other, and I said, who are we to be running these people's lives? And they looked at me as if I were a man from Mars, speaking a language they had never heard before.
Do you therefore believe, I mean, this is almost, university kind of debate. Do you therefore believe that the government has no responsibility for those less fortunate than ourselves? If free enterprise, they cannot find a place in the market economy?
Well, there are many things the government can do. I think the most important thing they can do is maintain a framework of law in which people do, in fact, find jobs and find progress. After all, this is not a hypothetical question as if this situation has never come up before. I mean, look at the entire history of the United States. Yeah. I mean, the United States did not become a prosperous country only after the New Deal. I mean, history didn't begin in the 1960s or even in the 1930s. And you look at the history of blacks, for that matter, that blacks have come a very long way, long before the first civil rights law was passed in the 1960s. In fact, in the 5 years prior to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, blacks rose into professional and similar occupations to a greater extent than in the 5 years afterwards.
So you would have, even if you look back now, as an economist and in some ways as a historian, at the civil rights legislation that was passed in 64, 65, through the Great Society, in terms of voting rights as well, you would say those laws, those civil rights laws, were unnecessary and counterproductive?
Oh no. You had to get rid of the Jim Crow system. You had to have voting rights and so on. But I remember back in 1964 writing to a friend, as the Civil Rights Act of 64 was being fought out in Congress, that I hoped this law would pass with absolutely no crippling amendments, exactly as it was written, because among other things, it had some good things in it. Was one reason, but the other reason was that I was convinced that it would not have the effect that they thought it would have, and that what I assumed very incorrectly was that once people saw that yes, this would break down the Jim Crow system, it would not cause any dramatic improvement in the economic condition of black people, and that people would then say, no, now we have to turn to something else in order to do that. And I was completely wrong about that. That when it didn't produce that result, they said, well, that just shows we need more of the same. Which is the old argument. We try policy X and it absolutely goes nowhere. We need stronger policy X.
This argument has been, I'm sure, voiced to you before. Clarence Thomas benefited from affirmative action.
Who said so?
Clarence Thomas says so, I bet.
No.
He doesn't?
No, he does not.
Clarence Thomas does not say that affirmative action programs helped him in terms of the educational opportunities he
received? He's never said it to me.
Do you think he would say no to that question?
He might well. For one thing, my understanding, and I haven't researched it, my understanding is that he was admitted to college the year before they began their affirmative action program.
I don't know his answer.
And what the program did was to delegitimize what he had done.
Yeah.
That he was a man with an outstanding academic record.
Right.
And he goes out into the job market, and despite this,
they look at him and they say, you got there only because of affirmative action, rather than because of your own merits.
Yeah, whereas ordinarily someone with that kind of record, you'd look at it and say, hey, this guy is really a world beater.
Hot, yeah.
But no, and I've seen that in my own life. I'm old enough that I've gone through the whole metamorphosis.
And what have you seen in your own life?
All right. When I was in the Marine Corps during the Korean War, I was trained as a photographer. And I was assigned to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, where a great many of Southerners were in the Marine Corps, white Southerners. And in that barracks, whenever somebody had a photographic problem, his camera wasn't working, his pictures didn't come out right, and so forth, they would come to me. I was astonished. The biggest redneck in the barracks would come to me to ask me, and there were all these white photographers.
Fix my camera.
Yeah, you see, why is this? And I finally figured it out. They said, if this guy is black and he's a photographer, he must be some photographer, you know. Now, when I started teaching in the early 1960s at Douglas College, I read up on all the stuff about new teachers, you see, and how it's hard to get the respect of the students, particularly if you're not much older than they are, and I looked younger than I was. And so I worried about that, you see, and I walked in that room the first day, and there was instant respect. And you know, it sort of took me aback. And I realized, no, they're saying, look, this guy, I was the first black male to teach there. This guy must be something else, you know. Go forward now 10 years. By this time, I've completed my degree. I've written my books, journal articles, all the whole thing. I'm now teaching at UCLA, and students will come up to me at the end of the term. They'll say how much they like the course and all that. And somewhere in the course of that, there'll be a slip up, and they'll let it out that they were quite surprised that the course was as good as it was. And one of the things that struck me even before the end of the term, one kid came to me one day, and he had a passage in the book he was having trouble with. And he said, "Can you tell me what this means?" I explained to him what that passage meant. He said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "Yes, I wrote the textbook." And he looked on the front, and he was really embarrassed. You know? But this is what affirmative action has done, you see.